Alright, so the next thing we're going to try is to convert Rebel Post. Let me switch up these bound in silence because that's going to bother me while I'm talking here. So Rebel Post, as you're familiar, is an 8-post deck that is aggro based. I talked about it in my article last week. It is something that works off of the rebels that allow them to search for others, using this extra mana to create kind of a weenie strategy out of a creature that has a terrible ability. So we're going to... a terrible ability otherwise. We're going to start off here, replacing our mana base. I have to admit, I think that Rebel Post, with or without the 8-post mana base, is not one of my favorite things. It feels incredibly weak to me. I've seen it show up a couple of times in daily events, and I'm always mildly impressed. I think it gains some benefit from the fact that we're no longer playing against Empty the Warrens, so people are less likely to be running things like Echoing Decay. Electrickery does find its way into a couple of sideboards. I think people are starting to get a little bit smarter about it. We have seen a couple of rats, but once Fissure is gone, you should see a lot more Crypt Rats and stuff like that. And a lot of these creatures, like the Sergeant here, are 1 toughness, and it doesn't work so well. I also think this is going to be a terrible idea, just from the basic fact that, we've talked about it in, I think, almost every video. You're increasing the amount of colorless mana you can produce and reducing the colored land producers. This deck, if you get a Ramosian Sergeant out on turn 3 or 4, it's terrible, because you still have to wait a turn to activate the ability, and you're going to have a turn 3 1/1 creature. Say you had to get a Prism out on turn 2 to make that happen in the first place. In turn 3 you're putting that into play. The ability won't be activated until turn 4, and you're looking at a turn 3 1/1. It's so underwhelming. It's something that, might be assumed by a player who thinks that Pauper can't do anything better than that. But, it's definitely evolved to a point where we've got faster decks, and there are definitely smarter plays. So I don't think it's going to work out too well. Again, taking out 8, adding 12. Now, I think I'm going to remove these 4 steeps instead of 4 planes. The steeps are really great. When you look at this as an 8-post deck, you do generate a lot of colorless mana, but you gain some addition. You're in white, so you don't have anything really in the way of card draw. It's getting what little card advantage it can out of these rebel abilities. So the steep early on, turn 1 plane, cycling a steep, is not a bad first turn. It's not great, obviously. It's not ideal, but it's not terrible. I think when you bring in the power plants and the towers and the mines, you really reduce the odds of you getting a steep cycled. Most of the time when you get that steep, you're probably going to want to play it, and then you're playing it and it comes into play tapped. So why would I want that? I think it's just an overall better choice to use the planes. Maybe in testing you could find that you're fine on the colors. It's not so terrible, and a steep or 2 could work their way back in. But we're not going to go that in-depth on it. We're kind of just, for these, going to take a chance and see, hey, let's do some generic replacements of lands and a spell or 2 to see if this is anywhat plausible. I think there really is something to be said. When I build decks, the first thing I do if I'm trying to alter a certain archetype is make the necessary changes and just give it a dry run and see how terrible it is. And once I see it in action with the changes, I can see, okay, maybe this card is terrible. And you continue to tinker it down more and more until you get something that is better interactive, works a lot stronger. So I think this is going to be that kind of introductory phase with all of these decks, just seeing how they hold up. Now looking at this list, again, my go-to is to bring in a 4th Expedition map and Prisms. Let's throw these in here because of the fact that Expedition map helps you find the Tron pieces and the colored land if you absolutely have to. Prism is going to provide you with an opportunity to filter that colorless mana into something usable. It's also going to give us that added card draw that we may, I guess, lose out from the steeps. So I think we're going to keep 4 of those in play. I think I really want to add this map. And I don't think there's much else I want to do. I could... and some of them I like to bring in the extra crushers, and I've talked about it, where you're generating so much colorless mana, you're going to get more benefit, I feel, out of a creature that does not require this colored mana. So in some of these decks, you have spells that require 2 colored mana. And that's going to be harder to cast for you, obviously, than something with only a single colored mana. And even easier to cast is a colorless thing, because it doesn't matter what lands you have in play, you should be able to put it into play once you get the appropriate amount of mana. So bringing in a third Crusher is kind of nice, but there's kind of a fine line in this particular deck where you want to keep together the whole Rebel strategy, or you're just completely altering the deck, and you might as well scrap it all together. So, bringing it in, I'm going to start looking at taking out things like the Glider or this Glider here. And that kind of, they're janky and they're not great, but they kind of give it flavor. They can be tutored up. And that's really the approach that this deck wants to take. It wants to be able to tutor up these creatures. It wants to find these options. And you can't tutor a Crusher. And now having, Crusher number 3 in our mono blue one isn't so bad because you have a lot of card draw options. And when you have that card draw option, it's easier for you to find. When you're running a deck like this, you have some opportunity to thin it out with Rebels. You are drawing some spells. Drawing some cards off of spells like Prism, but you're really not going to have the same draw capabilities that mono blue can, so your odds of finding a Crusher are lower than they are of, say, finding a Rebel. So I think that leaving Crushers at 2 is probably fine. Maybe if you want to keep that big threat count up, because it really is kind of your biggest beat, throw an extra one into the sideboard here. Again, we're not going to go into it too much, but this particular sideboard could probably use some altering, maybe take out this Sensor Bearer in favor of a Crusher if you really want to, or one of the Gliders. But I think that's just how it's going to have to be. I want to keep kind of that Rebel theme. I think the first thing I'm going to take out of this to cut it down is going to be these 2 Bone Splitters. Now, in a weenie deck, they're great. You get them out really early. You get them on one of these cheap guys. But since we're bringing so much colorless in, I kind of feel like it's going to decrease the chance that we get an early Rebel on turn 1 or 2. And so, decreasing that odds, I feel like the Bone Splitter is going to be, some might argue with this, maybe it'll be better in the late game. I really feel like it's a much better early game play, and we're kind of slowing this deck down. So we're going to take it out in favor of trying to really get things moving a little bit faster. I think another thing I want to take out is one of the 2 Zealot and Vex. This is kind of a great card. I'm a big fan of it. I like it in these decks. You have a lot of great targets for it. I think it works very well in the matchup against Delver. You can start picking off fairies or unflipped Delvers. I think maybe if you want to move it to the sideboard, I'm definitely okay with that. It has a lot of great utility. Some of the matches it takes real advantage is things like Elves. Elves is a deck that runs a lot of 1/1s. You can take away mana creatures, those important producers, and have great utility there, but Elves, I think, is a deck that is going to kind of fall out of favor. A lot of people kind of agree with me. I think Elves is going to be less important as we start to see more Crypt Rats come into play and a lot more control options. So I kind of feel like removing a Zealot here, maybe moving it to the sideboard if you wanted to go that route, is going to be the best way to go. Alright, so if we keep the Expedition map in here, we have to cut 2 more cards. What should we cut here? Maybe do we want a 4th map over a 4th Prism? Let's see, what else could we cut? I think if we try and keep this on point, and this might be a mistake, if we try and keep with the theme of the deck, and the deck wants to be aggressive, it wants to get creatures out, then reducing one of our control spells wouldn't be terrible. And our options as Journey to Nowhere or Bound in Silence, I think Bound in Silence wins. It does cost an extra mana to put into play. That's not as big a deal if you consider the mana you can generate off the Tron lands. It also is something that can be tutored up. Because this is a Rebel permanent, you can tutor it up with your Rebel tutors, and I think that gives it an edge over Journey, so we're going to cut Journey to 2. So now we're debating, 'cause like I said, I don't really want to cut too many of the Rebels unless you reduce all of a sudden its effectiveness as an aggro deck. Prism's kind of nice because you get the added draw. Map kind of guarantees you get that Tron land together. Thins out your deck some. I think we'll go with Expedition map. And again, this is something that maybe when playing the deck through, I'll change my mind about. I may find that, because Expedition map, face it, in the early game it's fantastic. As you approach the late game, you've already got an established mana base. You really don't need that Urza's Tower number 3 or power plant number 2. It's not as effective. And in the mid to late game, I think Prism gives you an advantage there. But I think in the early game, map does. And so I kind of want to keep it so I can try and... I mean, this deck can definitely get a lot of effectiveness out of the mana because you can activate multiple rebels and their search abilities. And I think ultimately, honestly, the deck's just going to be terrible if we do see an increase to board wipes. But I think map number 4 is what I would prefer over Prism. And we'll see how it plays out. Like I said, as I play through it, I might realize that that was not the right way to go. But we're going to give this a chance and see how this particular build plays out.